Welcome, listener, to Right Here, Right Queer. I'm Sebastian Nothwell, joined today by Jess Galaxie.
Hello.
Hello, Jess. Jess is the author of the cozy fantasy duology The Graveyard Trees, beginning with Feathers of Dawn, and the forthcoming Sapphic Faire romance How to Juggle Ballads and Blades.
That's me.
We're so excited to have you on board and to learn more about these books. Which of your books are you most excited to talk about today?
I think all of them. If you give me an opportunity to yap about any book that I am in the process of writing and or have already written, I will never stop. So
a big mood.
Yeah, it's one of those things.
Are you at a place where you can talk about how to juggle ballads and blades?
Yeah, I absolutely can.
Excellent. So, the phrase Sapphic Faire romance already has me sold, but just in case there's someone listening out there who isn't already on board, what's it all about?
So, it is about Shiko, who is a 25 to 28-year-old who's been a little bit lost in the world and has really found herself by her and her friend forming a Faire act. And so she finds herself working her first Faire summer season at Albion Renaissance Fair. Not a real Renaissance Fair, to be clear. I want to say that right now.
No actual Faire workers were hard in this reenactment.
Exactly. And she, in trying to become kind of friends with the people that are working there already, she ends up going out of her way to kind of help one of the other acts that's on the same stage as her. And in the process realizes she has a huge, stinking, sappy, sapphic romantic crush on one of the people in the other act. And so it's a lot of her trying to deal with navigating a semi-insular community that can be a little bit nervous about new people, while also trying to deal with the fact that she's having these kind of romantic feelings for this girl that she probably might only know for the summer and might not be able to see after this. You know, just for anyone who isn't as familiar with Fairs, a lot of Fair performances and performers are very transient. They move from Fair to Fair. So, you know, she's really kind of staring down this relationship that with this girl she really likes, but she's a little nervous about it. And so it's kind of a cute, fun rom-com. I really wanted it to be lighthearted, especially because in a lot of ways, Feathers of Dawn and Armor of Dusk were not. So I was like, I need something to cleanse the palate a little bit, especially in between some of my other whips that I'm working on, which are also a little bit more dramatic. So yeah, that's what How to Juggle Ballads and Blades is going to be about. I'm really excited for people to kind of, start getting to see the cover and everything, because I don't have any of it yet, but I have seen the cover art and everything, kind of in progress, and I'm very excited about it, and I'm excited to share it. So
the process behind creating cover art is so beautiful and fascinating to watch, honestly.
It really is. I work with a wonderful artist who's based in the Philippines, and I sent her literally a Canva presentation that said the vibes, and it was just a lot of a collage of very, very goofy photos that I pulled from various places. So I'm really excited. I have a great working relationship with her because she does all of my promotion art for Feathers of Dawn and Armor of Dusk, and she did the animation for that as well, both of those.
I was going to ask who did those animations because they're gorgeous.
Yeah, it's at Creams Are Crisp. Creams is spelled with a K. Definitely check Crisp out. I love their work so much. Friend of a friend, and I'm so glad that I found her because honestly, it's just, she does such a great job bringing characters to life.
They're just so evocative and soft. There's just such an immediate emotional response from so few frames.
Yeah, and I think that was something that, when we really sat down to do the animation for the first one that we did together, it was, very much, based on kind of a fandom thing that existed. So then when I kind of went back and was like, okay, we're going to do this other thing, and this is what I'm imagining, and getting to do the storyboards and stuff, that was really cool for me because I'm more of a narrative writer normally, so kind of doing visual storytelling was really fun.
That must have been such an incredible both collaborative experience and also getting to kind of stretch your creative energy in a new direction.
Yeah, it really was. I was, I've written video scripts and things like that before, but this was true visual storytelling, which is not something I've really gotten to do before. So I was like, oh, this is new and interesting, and it was really easy for me to do just because one, it's really short, and two, it was so new that I was excited about it, and it was a little less of that some of the burnt out energy you can sometimes get when you're doing a lot of writing. So
I'm so sorry, a very loud cat has just stumbled into the room.
It's okay. I was like, is that a cat?
It is a cat. He has received both of his dinners, but not his cuddles, and now he's irate. Hi, baby boy.
Oh, how dare.
I know. It's so sad to be you.
It's so sad to be a cat who spends all their time asleep in a little bed.
Circling back to the Ren Fair, do you have any experience with that community firsthand, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have never worked or performed at a Renaissance fair, but I am very fortunate to live within like 40 minutes of the Bristol Renaissance Fair, which it's near the Chicagoland area. So pretty much anyone in the Chicago or Wisconsin area ends up at the Bristol Renaissance Fair if you're interested in going to that sort of thing. And, you know, for me, growing up, my family wasn't really nerdy in that way, I guess is a good way to say it. So I didn't really go for the first time. I had seen it and I had been interested in it, but I didn't get to go for the first time until I was in college. Or no, actually I was out of college now that I'm thinking about it. But, you know, I was an adult. I just immediately kind of fell in love. I love to make costumes. I've been in anime spaces for a really long time. I've done cosplay before. So, you know, I started going yearly, and now my friends and I go every year for at least a weekend, if not multiple days. I am very fortunate because Bristol runs from the 4th of July through like Labor Day, which I know sometimes they're really short. Yeah.
That's a dream season, that is.
It is the hottest part of the year, but it does run for a really long time, which is great. You know, I've seen a lot of the different performers there and kind of interacted with a lot of the performers. And, you know, just over the years, friends of friends have performed there and things like that. And so I've gotten to kind of know people. And so it's just like such a good, fun little community. And I think that's part of the reason that I try to be very clear that like the Ren Fair in the book is not a real Ren Fair. And I don't want anyone to associate anything that's going on with the book because, you know, it's a rom-com. There's some drama that happens. I just want to make sure that like, you know, these communities don't get harmed because I feel like they are such like a very open and welcoming community. I think Bristol especially has been very open to queer people being there and being out and loud and proud for years. You know, obviously that's not a 100% thing, but, you know, you get to, you know, see other queer people kind of just being themselves there in a way that is very nice. And, you know, nobody's kind of stopping them. A lot of times they're being interacted with by the performers and things like that. And it's a very supportive community. And I think that's what really kind of drew me to it as far as like trying to write about it. I've also been very, very intrigued seeing like online on TikTok, Ren Fair performers talking about their experiences working there and like living in like the trailers and, you know, traveling from place to place. And so that was another thing that like kind of really drew me into it and made me want to write the book. It was one of those situations where I was in the height of trying to finish Armor of Dusk and we were at Ren Fair and I looked at my best friend and I said, I should write a rom-com about Ren Fair performers. And she went, you should finish the book you're working on. I was like, you're right.
That is a good friend.
Yeah, I love her very much. I appreciate her. And she was correct. So yeah, it was born out of like a literal trip. Like I was literally sitting there. I think I was watching the Mud Show actually, which if anyone's been to the Bristol Renaissance Fair, they're familiar with. But it was one of those things where I was very I did get sassed, but it did, you know, it stayed in the back of my mind and I was like, no, this is a really solid idea. I should do this. So.
Oh man, it sounds like both the Ren Fair in reality and the resulting book will be magical experiences.
I hope so. That is the goal. I think especially for me kind of coming into writing like a contemporary romance from being someone who's really more of a fantasy reader, I'm really hoping I do the romance part of it justice. I definitely hope it is a magical experience. And, you know, I really hope that people enjoy the characters. The two main characters are named Chico and Monty. And Chico comes from like a very famous like French jester. That's like the whole thing that's going on with her. So like, and her act is she's a jester and she's a silly little guy and she's got a mask on for her performance and everything. And so I'm having so much fun like writing about the performances, especially, you know, kind of sitting and thinking about the ones that I've seen and being like, okay, well, how do I describe something like that? So I'm hoping magical experience would be exactly what I'm hoping for out of this book. So
fantastic. Speaking of your characters, do you have a favorite character that you've created?
of my characters that I really, really love and I think about all the time and I go back to all of the time, Dradivai really is one for me. They were, in a lot of ways, like just like a really fun, bright character to write, and I really enjoyed I wound up cutting any chapters from their point of view in either of the books for various reasons, but I really enjoyed writing from their perspective in a lot of ways, so that's maybe something that I can do in the future. But Dradivai is really kind of top tier, and I also... Erwin, who is kind of such a random side character in both Feathers of Dawn and Armor of Dusk, I actually really love him, and part of it is because he's like loosely based on a character I really like from Critical Role. He's inspired by a character from Critical Role, and so that he's another character that I really enjoy writing, and I like getting into his head and thinking about how he would react to situations. And then as far as like for upcoming, for How to Juggle Ballads and Blades, I had a lot of fun writing Shiko. I'm non-binary, so it was really fun for me to kind of revisit, what it's like to be like fully like a 25-year-old girl in a way. Because, I am AFAB, and I knew I was non-binary by the time I was 25, but, just like kind of getting to like think about femininity again and kind of in a way reclaim it a little bit in a way I haven't in a long time, I think was really, really fun for me. And so that's something that I'm really excited as I'm working on that book, which I'm waiting for edits, but, as I'm working on the book, I'm having a lot of fun kind of leaning back into that and thinking about, kind of just what it's like what girlhood is like in a way. And, kind of getting to have a reminder of that experience has been really fun.
That sounds like a really wholesome and healing writing exercise.
Yeah, it really was. And this is not really a spoiler. There's kind of like a subplot in the book with Monty, who is grew up kind of in that like tomboy-ish vibe. And she's the main love interest. And she kind of grew up as a tomboy and like in her adulthood is kind of reclaiming her femininity. And I started adding it to the book as kind of like a secondary little subplot because I just kind of needed something to create a little bit more connection between the characters. And I found myself like finding that story and that subplot being very healing for me as someone who grew up very tomboyish and then like realized they were non-binary and like still sometimes experiences or like wants to experience femininity in the way that an AFAB person does, but also still sometimes wants to experience masculinity and things like that. So I had a lot of fun kind of playing with those things. And I think for me, like one of my big things is I love kind of including those storylines and those like meditations on gender and sexuality without making the book kind of about it. I think that's something that I end up doing a lot, probably just because it's something that I think about literally all of the time. So
at this point, it feels like the cliche to say it's refreshing, but it is kind of refreshing to have a story that can include that without it being the sole crux upon which the story turns, and also a very kind of dramatic after-school special vibe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I kind of grew up in a time where a lot of the queer media that I saw was coming out stories. So I think for me, now that we're kind of hitting this time where we're getting more and more LGBTQIA representation in a whole like pantheon of various genres and styles and, that surround very different topics, it's been really nice for me. It's been very healing, I think, in a way, just because, there was a certain moment, especially in like the early 2000s and like early to mid 2010s, where that was like really the media that we got, like the community got. We got coming out stories. And then, sometimes if you knew what you were doing, you were like reading manga or things like that, you could find queer stories that weren't necessarily about that. But so I think, kind of now seeing like this just absolute explosion, I think, of queer books and media in general has been so great over the last few years.
Absolutely. What drew you to your chosen subgenres of cozy fantasy or fantasy in general?
I think for me, the big thing with fantasy has always been the ability to kind of escape the world. I was always a daydreamer growing up, so, kind of getting to be in a place that was so different from everything and, being able to read fantasy books and feeling very transported was always something that I really enjoyed. And then at a certain point for me too, it just kind of became, I liked dragons, I liked knights, I enjoyed watching like sword fighting more than like gunfighting and things like that. So, I kind of just gravitated in general towards fantasy for a whole host of reasons. How I particularly fell into cozy fantasy was like a little bit unintentional. I wrote Feathers of Dawn, and I had given it to my good friend. I don't talk about this much, but Dradavai is essentially supposed to be like fantasy Filipino. I like rooted them in a specific culture for a host of reasons I don't need to get into right now. But because of that, I had my friend who is Filipino American read it as like a sensitivity read. And so after reading it, came to me and said, you know, this really feels like cozy mystery, but a fantasy. And I was like, oh, that is interesting. I never really thought about it, but I could see like why. So I started kind of looking things up and being like cozy mystery fantasy. And that's kind of how I stumbled across like the term cozy fantasy. And from there, that was kind of how I started marketing Feathers of Dawn. I was like, okay, this is like a cozy fantasy. I think especially because, you know, the Graveyard Tree's duology is a romance, like a true romance. It has a happily ever after, but Feathers of Dawn does not. So I was very hesitant to call it like a fantasy romance. I was trying to like find a way to describe it that didn't include the word romance because I didn't want people to be very upset if they read it and then it didn't have like some of those genre conventions that are expected of romance. And so when I found cozy fantasy, I was like, oh, this really does seem to fit. And I started reading some of like the comparable books where, you know, at the time, Legends of Lattes was the one that came up a lot, all of the time. But then, you know, Can't Spell Treason Without Tea kind of was another one that for me. And then a lot of Jay Penner books was also, you know, another thing that I was looking at really closely. And I was like, okay, yeah, this does seem to fit kind of what I'm doing. And so it was just very much happenstance. And to an extent, it was a result of myself trying to figure out how to market a book for the first time. It is the thing that makes the most sense for the series, I think, even though it does get dark at times. And I think that's something that I've talked about in other spaces and stuff with cozy fantasy in particular. Just, you know, there's a lot of conversations about like how dark can you actually go? And I think there's a lot of play even within that genre to go very dark and do very difficult topics, but still kind of covering this like feeling of like, or bringing this feeling of like comfort and safety that, you know, sometimes you get out of a cozy mystery. So I hope that made sense.
But yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And like, yeah, like you said, cozy fantasy and cozy genres in general really do give you kind of like this safe area in which to explore lighter themes or deeper themes as the need arises.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, something that I really love about a lot of those cozy genres is the fact that like a lot of them don't really shy away from dark stuff, especially when I was like calling Feathers of Dawn cozy fantasy. And I was like, but is it really cozy? Because all of this bad stuff happens. And then I had a moment at one point where I was like, yeah, but sometimes in cozy mystery, someone gets murdered.
Most of the time they do.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, I can't really...
Sometimes they open on a straight up corpse and I'm like, whoa, should I let Grandma read this? I don't know.
Exactly. So it was just kind of one of those things where I started to really think about it, and like a lot of those cozy genres really don't shy away from those things. And it's interesting how that is the term that we've all started using for it. I find like the way that like genre names come into existence very interesting. Like I've been following everything with romantasy for a long time because I find it so intriguing how it's like it's come to be its own genre, even though like fantasy romance always existed and so did romantic fantasy, but now romantasy it almost feels like its own thing in a way. Nobody get mad at me for that. I don't know how true that is though. But it's interesting to watch those genres and those definitions kind of like change and form as time goes on, which is, you know, fun.
Yeah. With cozy fantasy in particular, it's definitely like the cozy isn't necessarily the content, but just the feeling it leaves you with.
Exactly. And I think that's something that is so important that I don't think people necessarily think about when you're talking about genre is like, what is the feeling that you walk away with? There's like a lot of genres too that when you think about it, like, or like you'll hear people talk about particular books and they're like, that book is a horror book to me because like the situation in the book is meant to be like a happy one or whatever, but it is someone's worst nightmare.
Yeah.
So I think about that a lot too.
One of those, what they call on TV tropes, fridge horror.
Yes, exactly. Where it's just like, I would never want that for myself, actually. Which I get.
I let my brain dwell on the happily ever after for 1 second too long, and uh-oh, everything's falling apart.
Yes, exactly. It's like, you know, when you really think about certain things a little too much.
What are some themes that you love to explore or revisit in your writing?
I love to explore queerness and like gender identity, kind of outside of necessarily talking about it within the context of the real world. I think that's very clear from the Graveyard Trees duology, which is, with the Graveyard Trees duology, it was very much a meditation on what it is like to be kind of visibly queer versus like not. Which is kind of how we wind up with like this dragon and like someone who is a half dragon, and kind of thinking about things in terms of what is it like to kind of live that life and how does it differ from an experience. So that's something that I like to explore a lot, is kind of like the differences in those experiences. Another thing for me, I think, that is a theme that I really like to kind of play with is kind of like government bad, but also just like, government corruption and things like that. And, how even when a government seems very idyllic, it can still have its really bad parts to it. So I think something that I tend to like get into with government in particular is kind of examining like how different forms of government may or may not actually help or harm, and what might be going on beyond, what you're actually seeing. And then I think something that kind of goes along with that too is just even examining like those different kinds of governments in a society that is still like capitalist, and still very focused on money in particular. I think for me, there is a reflection of capitalist corporations in kind of the mages that are doing a lot of the bad things in the Graveyard Trees duology. And I will never forget this. I once like accidentally saw a review. I did not mean to read it. I don't normally like look at reviews and things like that, but someone said the villain was a little too black and white for me. Like they weren't gray enough. And I was like, okay, that's fair. But also like, there's not really a lot of gray in capitalism. Like when it really comes down to it. It's so, with villains and things like that too, I think that's something that I kind of tend to lean into. And a lot of times their motivations are very much like money and power and greed. And I think that is also very much a result of just the world in general. But then also on top of that, I really love to kind of have stories that have a happy ending for the queer people that are in it. I think that's like a big thing for me, is giving them those happily ever afters that, for many years we didn't get for a lot of reasons. So that's something that I like to explore. And then also, kind of thinking about, kind of going along with that, thinking about what a queer happily ever after looks like, because it's not necessarily the same as a heterosexual happily ever after. It's not necessarily a nuclear family unit and things like that. So that's something that I like to explore a lot. And, like the found families, it's always the joke that like every queer person's favorite trope is found family. But
sometimes there's like a cool sociological reason for that.
Sometimes there is in fact a cool sociological reason for that. But at the same time, it is very true. And it's something that I think, has shaped a lot of LGBTQIA people, in that they're like, their happily ever after is going to look different than a modern heterosexual happily ever after. And so I think that's something that I think about a lot too when I'm writing. And I think that's going to end up very much coming to light in How to Juggle Ballads and Blades. I won't say too much there, but obviously there is a very different happily ever after for characters whose job is to literally travel 8 months out of the year, if not 10. So, and that's something I like to think about too, is just like, how do your different like life circumstances results in, what seems like a happy ending for you.
One of my favorite parts about the queer romance genre is how, by the very nature of its being, it can avoid what feel like cookie cutter happily ever afters.
Yeah.
Like you said, the recognition that a happy ending for one person is a nightmare for someone else.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that it's really cool. It's a really cool thing about the genre. And then on top of that, it is a result of every member of the community's work leading up to this very moment that we are able to like have a lot more stories like that. For me, every time I see kind of those explorations of like a non-cookie cutter happily ever after, it's really exciting when you think about it, because there's been a lot of work over the years that led up to that. And, there was plenty of times and people will talk about the like old, I don't remember what they were called, like the penny novels, like the...
Yes, pulp paperbacks.
Yes. Yeah, pulp paperbacks where, you get this like pulp fiction where, like there would be lesbian characters, but like they had to have a bad ending. It was like part of the only way you could get it published, basically. And, we're so far away from that. It's really nice to kind of see the fact that we are far away from it and be reminded that we are far away from it. I think every time I get reminded that gay people get to be happy is a good moment for me. I want them to stay winning. That's my goal.
May we stay winning. What stories inspire you?
So many. I'm going to preface this by saying I'm dyslexic. I'm a very slow reader. So I grew up not reading a ton. I've read way more in my adulthood than I did in my childhood or my teenage years. That being said, even as a teenager, I read so much manga, copious amounts of manga, because obviously when you're dyslexic and you're, trying to like read, the imagery being there can be really helpful. And so I read a lot of comics and a lot of manga because it was a lot easier and a lot quicker for me to read as opposed to something that was like a book that could be really dense. And so because of that, I've read probably like every single BL novel that came out between like 2008 and like 2014, if it got like scantilated. So a lot of those books really inspired me, and a lot of those stories really inspired me. And I think, I've had people say like, oh, your book reminds me of a webtoon. And I'm like, well, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. And so I, spent years and years and years not only reading BL, but also reading like a lot of shonen and shoujo manga. I was a very prolific manga reader, and so I've read a lot of the very like famous BL and a lot of the very famous manga that has come out and especially made it to the United States. So, a lot of those have inspired me a lot, especially in the last few years, getting to see even more and more of it actually coming to the United States in like a real printed format, because I will admit most of the time when I was doing this, I was reading manga illegally online. But, now we're getting things like something like I think Pink Heart Jam is a really good example of it. That is so something that I would have read between, like 2010 and 2014 that I would have never been able to get a print version of, and I probably would have forgotten that I read it. And maybe at some point even reread it and halfway through realized I read it already. But, Pink Heart Jam is a really good example of something that, like I bought that in a bookstore. Like I was wandering around a bookstore. Well, granted, it was Kinokuniya, so like it was a manga bookstore.
A specialty bookstore, but a bookstore nonetheless.
A bookstore. I've seen it at Barnes & Noble since then, so... But, I was wandering around a bookstore and I went, oh, this looks interesting. And I brought it home and I read it. Nowadays we have so much more access to that stuff. So like a lot of those books really inspire me. As far as like fantasy inspiration goes and things like that and like more book things, I'm a huge Diana Wynne Jones fan. I read the Howl's Moving Castle books actually in college. I had mentioned that Howl's Moving Castle was my favorite Ghibli movie to a friend, and her immediate response was, did you know there's a book? So I was like, oh, no, I didn't. So I read the Howl's Moving Castle series, which is obviously, it's a middle grade. It's a little over middle grade. It's kind of like a young YA. And then I actually went back and read her Crestomancy series, which is truly a middle grade series. And I really enjoyed that. And I've been reading the Discworld series on and off for years. I think my favorite of those is Tiffany Aching. And, I'm also a huge Ursula K. Le Guin fan. One of my college professors got me really into her. Left Hand of Darkness is one of my favorite books of all time. I went and read Those Who Walk Away from Omelas. As an adult, apparently that was an assigned reading in a lot of people's school. But yeah, I've read a lot of her various series on like I think they're called like The Other Humans or something like that. I'm blanking on the name right now. But like her sci-fi series is really where I'm at. And then for like more contemporary, Charlie Jane Anders was another really big inspiration for me. I read All the Birds in the Sky, and that was pretty formative for my writing. My actual style of like novel writing, I guess, or book writing. Storytelling would be a good way to put it.
A very handy reading list you've put together.
Yeah. Very all over the place, I feel like.
Eclectic.
Eclectic is a good way to put it. And, it's so funny, too, because, like, whenever I mention the manga, I'm like, please don't ask me the titles of any of these manga. I probably could not tell. It would take me a lot.
Also, if any of them have received official translations since then, the title is also probably vastly different in English.
Yes, that is the other thing, too, is like, I think I went through this recently with Dungeon Meshi when it came out, and people started being like I would say Dungeon Meshi, and they'd be like, what's that? And I'd be like, Delicious in Dungeon. Like, You know what I'm talking about. I know you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, no. What do you hope to accomplish with your stories?
I think most of my stories, I hope to accomplish two major things. One is to make people find joy. And then I think my other thing is to write a story that I feel I would have wanted to read as a kid. I'm mostly writing adult books now, which sounds strange. But, as especially as a teenager, I think, I was reading adult books as a teen, and writing those things that I would have liked reading is something that I think is really important to me. And it's one of the things I really kind of am trying to accomplish anytime I'm sitting down and writing a book. I think the other big thing is just making a book that people find joy in is just so rewarding. Even if that joy is expressed in oh my God, I'm so mad at you for the ending of the book. Because, I did, when I did finish Feathers of Dawn and I started giving it to people, they'd be like, I'm so angry, but also I'm so happy, but also I'm so angry. So, there's a certain kind of joy in being able to get that sort of reaction and create that sort of reaction. I think that actually is really what it is about, is kind of just making people feel something is a big part of what I want to accomplish. I would also say to, maybe to get people to be a little bit more empathetic is another big one for me. I think Feathers of Dawn and Armor of Dusk are a big reflection of that. And I do think there is a certain level of, I believe in the inherent empathy that people have for their fellow man, but at the same time, I do think in general our society could be a little bit more empathetic. I think that's something that we could work on a little bit.
Just a tad.
Yeah. Maybe reading a story like mine hopefully will help a little bit, and, getting them to see that sometimes that's the most important thing there is. And yeah.
Noble goals all around.
Thank you.
Do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
One of my biggest pieces of advice is what you're doing is actually special and difficult. Something that I faced a lot, I was constantly working on books from a pretty young age, since I was probably 16-ish. And I think one of my biggest struggles was a lot of times when you tell someone you're writing a book or that you've written a book, you get a lot of, oh, I've always wanted to write a book, as if it's something that they could just do, but they don't.
Yeah.
So, for me, I think, being an aspiring author and wanting to publish one day, I think for me it was really important to remember that what I was doing was special. It was difficult. And if it was as easy as everyone made it out to be, you would have done it already. And so just, keeping in mind that what you're doing is hard, and it obviously it's going to get easier as you kind of do more of it, but also just remembering and giving yourself the grace that you are doing something difficult. I think that was something that I really struggled with when I was an aspiring author, was, giving myself the grace that I hadn't finished it, I hadn't published it, I hadn't done this or that, because all of these things are very difficult, and, there's different barriers to entry and things like that. So I think a lot of authors could really use a reminder that that imposter syndrome isn't real, if that makes any sense. You're going to be an author, you're going to get there if you really want to get there. And also it's not as easy as everyone makes it out to be. And don't let that feeling of, if people make it out to be so easy, why haven't I finished this, or why haven't I done it? Don't let that get in your head too much, I guess, if that makes any, I'm not sure I'm making sense.
You are making a great deal of sense.
Okay, that makes me feel better. Because I think it's something that's so hard, because people treat writing like it's nothing because we have to do it so much. But writing a bunch of text messages or emails for work is very different from writing a book. And so I think, just keeping that in mind, and, your uncle that's always oh, I've always meant to write a book, I feel like I could be a great writer. If he hasn't done it yet, he's not going to do it. So
if he really wanted to, he would make time.
Exactly. It's one of those things, you will make time. If you really want to do it, you will make the time, and it's not easy. And then the other thing is, understand whether or not you want to be traditionally published or self-published before you go into it. I think that's a big one too, for me, just because that really changed kind of certain things I did with Feathers of Dawn once I was kind of you know what, I'm just going to self-publish this. I don't think I want to query this book. that really changed kind of my perspective on how I was doing certain things and like how I worked with my editor and things like that too. So like knowing that can be really helpful.
Kind of giving you a good framework to approach the issue from.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than trying to do two different directions at once.
Yes, which is, I feel like, very common nowadays, is people like kind of like go into self-publishing in the hopes of eventually being traditionally published, which can happen. It's just like...
It does happen, but
sometimes also like just, you know, having an understanding of like which one looks like success to you.
Yes.
Might be a good idea from the start. So
maybe looking into what success actually looks like from the inside of both of these experiences and then determining.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's another big thing is like understanding success in like the writing and publishing world is so strange. So, you know, kind of understanding it and thinking about it, because, you know, I get people all the time that are like, oh, is your book profitable? And I'm like, no, I spent so much money on editing, but I'm making money. So it'll get there eventually. And I find that to be a certain level of success. So
do you have half an hour to 5 hours to talk about the concept of earning out in traditional publishing? Let's dive in.
Oh, man. Yeah.
So where can folks catch up with you and your writing online?
Yeah. So I'm at GalaxieBot across pretty much every single platform out there. Galaxy is always spelled with an IE for me. You can also, if you look up Jess Galaxie, you will find me. But then, yeah, you can follow me on pretty much any of the traditional social medias you think of. I'm probably most active on Instagram right now. I will be honest, I have ADHD, and the social media I am most active on changes on a regular basis. But right now it's Instagram.
Come over to Tumblr. We're having a weird time.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so you can find me on Instagram, and you know, anywhere that I have a social media, my link tree is in my bio. You can check that out. I do have a newsletter that I'm trying to remember to do at least once a quarter. But also, if you follow the newsletter, you will get first updates on things like beta reading opportunities and advanced readers copies. So, you know, all of that is in there as well. And I will be hopefully utilizing it for that, because I've been collecting emails on my How to Juggle Ballads and Blades thing, because I'm trying to be professional.
A struggle we know well.
So well. It's I feel like every indie author has like their own little brand of, this is how I'm trying to be professional.
Our own little methods of, dare I say, juggling.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure talking with you, and we hope to hear more from you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to all of the listeners.